David Lammy hasn't said anything about Donald Trump that's worse than JD Vance has said. And he seems to have profited from his previous statements.
He did have to go to Mar-a-Lago and grovel quite a lot, though, didn't he?
What do you think will hold David Lammy back?
Here we are again, then. It's Matt Chorley with How to Win Election, joined as ever by New Labour Mastermind Peter Mandelson, Polly Mackenzie's Policy Mackenzie, former Director of Policy for Nick Clegg, and Tory Brainbox Daniel Finkelstein is here. You can get in touch, email us howtowin@thetimes.co.uk, as quite a few people have done over the question of what is and isn't drill. So last week we had a drill version of the theme. You've been listening to it on repeat ever since, Peter.
I got a Black & Decker and that was as far as I went.
I don't believe you've ever used a drill. Do you really do your own DIY?
That's
Sure,
really
you get a man
really
in, come
unfair.
on.
Yeah. My whole image is being traduced here. I'm being turned into somebody who never goes to a supermarket, never picks up a drill.
But to be
totally
clear,
incapable. No, I haven't picked up a drill.
So Mark got in touch saying, big fan of the podcast. I liked both the Punjabi and the drill version very much, but I thought you were very rude about the drill version. I thought the least you could do was acknowledge the time and effort of God as such a creative tribute to your work, which is true, Mark. However, Ed got in touch saying, my 17-year-old son, Louis, reliably informs me that the latest episode's opening theme was, in fact, grime rather than UK drill. A great show. I wasn't a fan of the theme tune initially, but you've made it work. So there we are. Turns out it was grime, not drill. So you needn't have worried yourself, Peter.
God, I've been sleepless for a week.
But it's okay, Danny. You'll be pleased with this. We've got a drum and bass version from James. Would you like to hear it?
I would.
Here we go.
It starts off with the trumpet, and then they added a xylophone and a double bass, and then here we are.
Are they real instruments?
They're real instruments. No expense spared.
This should definitely chase off the last few of the listeners, I should think.
I should say, though we too we are amused by it, obviously, but it's amazing the time and trouble and the talent actually involved in this. I wouldn't know where to start with any of it. It's amazing. That was brilliant.
Really nice.
We should have a club night.
When I was in Frome last weekend, as one does, we'd been basically out all day. We'd had some dinner. We went to a pub. And on the way back, we stumbled across an outdoor pop-up drum and bass event on the back
Frome?
of it's very Frome. Just on the back of a lorry in a car park. Lots of sort of posh people with nose piercings down.
Is this story going anywhere? Or?
No, but it's just
okay.
I've recently some drum and bass. It's all drum and bass.
Trying to pretend to be cool.
Yeah.
How did they vote?
In Frome, Lib Dem, I think. Yeah.
Nice.
Used to be David Heath's constituency.
Famously, Somerset and Frome.
Yeah.
Very, very
Not famously. I mean, that's going a bit far.
I mean, David Heath?
Yes.
He was
He
a
had a
government
lot-
minister.
He was.
Yeah, he had a large
Farming
beard.
minister.
Okay, I'm sorry.
Large beard.
That's like her not knowing Eric Heffer. I can't.
Well, that's less explicable.
Right, anyway, let's move on. We had an email in from Matthew with an interesting question. Hello, Matt, Polly, Danny and Peter. I'm Matthew from Leicester. I really enjoy the podcast. I've gone back and listened to all the episodes. Yeah, people have been binging it. He says,
Sad people.
I'd like
Better
to...
than binging chocolate, isn't it?
Well, exactly.
You don't put on a
It's
single
good for you.
pound.
It's good for you. There's been a lot of focus on what the political position of the next Tory leader might be, but isn't an electoral strategy just as important? Should the Tories be looking to appoint their own Morgan McSweeney? Do they think bringing back someone like Dominic Cummings is a good idea?
Well, can I just start on the Dominic Cummings thing? He wouldn't have time because I was on Twitter the other day after the assassination attempt on Donald Trump, and I noticed that Dominic Cummings had lent in to offer the Secret Service his expert advice on their hiring policy, so he wouldn't have time to the Conservatives' electoral program. I think that, what actually that incident with Dominic Cummings and Boris Johnson illustrated is your leadership and what they want to do, and who they then employ to work with them on their electoral strategy have got to be together. So actually, I flatly disagree with the idea. I think, first of all, the Conservative Party has got to decide what it wants to be and who for, and then it can start to think about how to shape that into a message and electoral strategy. Clearly, it would help if the Conservative Party involved at the high level capable strategists looking at the problems that it has got in front of it. But at this point, there's a lot of work to do before they can start to think about fighting elections for anything.
Any party would be very lucky indeed to have a Morgan McSweeney working for them. But the difference between McSweeney and Cummings is that both are very, very clever, but McSweeney manages and leads, whereas Cummings just sets light to everything and everyone around him.
So we should explain, Morgan McSweeney is the campaign director for Keir Starmer.
Yeah.
I mean, he almost came before Keir Starmer, didn't he, in the sort of how to rescue the Labour Party?
Oh, yeah, he started...
He was running Labour together and identified Keir Starmer as the candidate. So maybe you do just need a guru.
Well, I think, oddly enough, that we're being slightly unfair to Dominic Cummings. That's astonishing. But
you look like you're malfunctioning, Paul.
I'm feeling, a sense of personal trauma. But because, actually, as an election strategist, Dominic Cummings won the AV referendum, the Brexit referendum, and then the 2019 election. And the governing that they did before that 2019 election was pretty limited and really just about sound and fury to mobilise before the 2019 election. Where Dominic Cummings was unable to transfer any of his skills was to a governing strategy that would support a future electoral strategy. And that's where you absolutely, as Danny said, you need a leader who can define what you want the party to be. You need an electoral strategist who can deliver that. But you also need a governing strategy that's also aligned. And it may be that you need a different sort of person. I mean, Morgan McSweeney is not the person who is now in charge of number 10, right? Like, there's Sue Gray, they're bringing in... but he's not in charge of governing.
Peter's pulling a series of faces for the benefit of listeners.
It remains my view,
Yeah.
right, that you win elections in
Yes.
order to govern, and you don't govern to win elections.
I agree that, first of all, I think Dominic Cummings is very insightful, interesting person. And when I read what he has to say about elections, you have to read a lot because he expresses himself at great length, but it's actually usually worth it. And I think he does understand a lot about modern political terrain. He's really worth listening to. I think he's got very particular ideas, and it's very difficult for anyone to work with him who isn't willing to go along with those absolutely. And he ended up in Downing Street concentrating in specific areas which he thought were important. Actually, in some ways, he was governing rather than running electoral strategy. But ultimately, the Conservative Party needs first to determine who and what it is. It can get colleagues who may ultimately be very good at election strategy because they have an idea of how to turn the Conservative Party into a governing force. But I mean, I'll be very interested in Peter's view on this, because my view, Peter, about why you were very effective and very important was not because you got the red rose and all those things which were very professional. It was because you had a very clear understanding of how to make Labour a governing force by changing who it was. And that was a political understanding. It wasn't really about your being an electoral strategist, and the Conservative Party needs to have that first. If someone involved in that then turns out to be imaginative and creative at other things as you were, then they can become an election strategist. But first, it needs to work on what it is and who it is and why it is.
These are two sides of a single coin. They can't be separated. You need somebody with a very clear sense of the politics of the country, the electorate, and the party. Those things have to be put together, and you create a strategy to win power. And the reason I was pulling a face when Polly was speaking was because she said, you don't govern to win elections. Well, I'm afraid that is precisely what you do if you want to see through your policies, change the country, can maintain your appeal to the electorate, sustain your coalition, your electoral coalition, and get back into office so that you can finish the job. And these are very important, which brings me back to McSweeney and Cummings. The reason why McSweeney was important, as you've alluded to, is because during the Corbyn era, he devised a strategy to reclaim, to win back sort of power from the hard left, to re-empower, re-enfranchise the massive party members so that they could get behind an alternative leader with an alternative appeal to the public and an alternative election-winning strategy. It's largely an untold story, this, but it started in about 2017, 2 years before the 2019 election, which Corbyn lost so disastrously. And during that 2 years, he put together this strategy, which had all these different facets to it, and sort of, as it were, took it to Keir Starmer, who bought into it, who embraced it. And that was the basis of Keir's election campaign for the leadership. And it's remained the basis of his campaigning and his offer to the British people and why he was elected the other week, ever since. So you obviously need a strategy at the heart of all this. But, when I think back to, in the 1980s, Kinnock was elected leader because the party had had enough of Ben and all his acolytes and Polly, Eric Heffer as well.
And he'd had enough of me.
And decided that we needed somebody to change and modernise the party from the left. Okay, and so he took it towards the centre. 1990s, they chose Blair because they realised the party hadn't changed enough and it needed turbocharging. 2010, the party actually and the MPs chose David Miliband because they wanted him to continue with the sort of Blair-Brown strategy, but to revamp it. Now, don't ask me what happened in 2015 with Jeremy Corbyn. That's a separate, albeit related story. But the point about Starmer's election as leader is because the party decided again it needed to move from the left towards the centre, and he was their man. And that's what the Tories have got to do now. They've got to decide primarily, how they are going to appeal, how they're going to win the next election. And I agree with Danny's view. They have to, move from the right to the centre in order to build an electoral coalition that will enable them to command enough popular support to win the election. And if they don't do that, then they'll choose a different strategy and a different leader. And in my view, they will crash and burn.
Want to get your old mate Steve Hilton back?
I think Steve is now a big fan of Donald Trump, isn't he?
He is.
Yeah.
He's a big Trump man in the United States.
But maybe one Trump wins, but that would not do what Peter's describing and take them to.
Actually, interestingly,
take them to the
Steve
centre.
Hilton didn't see himself as an electoral strategist, and he got quite cross about lots of things, but he got quite cross in particular about being called an electoral strategist.
He got cross when Barack Obama came to visit Number 10, and the embassy specifically sent instructions ahead that he had to have shoes and socks on.
So Steve Hilton was a Tory strategist, blue sky thinker.
Philosopher.
In fact, blue sky, because didn't he want to shoot down clouds? Wasn't that one of his ideas?
I think he was interested in sort of geoengineering solutions to
And you shared an office
climate
with him.
change.
Look
I
what
shared an
happened
office with him.
Look what happened when they did that in Dubai. The place was completely flooded out.
My further Steve Hilton anecdote is that most mornings, his colleague Rohan Silva, another clever chap around the Conservative Party of that era, would come in with 2 iced buns from Greggs, and they would have them for breakfast.
What, together?
Yeah, but I was there too, and he never brought me an iced bun.
Is that because you had shoes on?
I don't know.
I don't think it wasn't in the coalition agreement, I think.
Yeah, you need to get that written down, nailed down at the very beginning. We've discussed the importance of snacks before.
Yeah.
Did he ever put shoes on in the office?
From time to time. I mean, because he came on his bicycle, and so
Was
you
there
can't really cycle in bare feet. That's just
an
uncomfortable.
aroma?
No.
No.
I went. He had a joint birthday party with Michael Gove, and I went to it and
Well,
got.
like soft play.
It was his, I think. I went and got caught in the rain, and he very generously lent me a T-shirt to change out of my soaking wet clothes, and it was
So that you could go to Michael Gove's birthday party?
Steve and Michael's birthday party at Steve's house. And I wore this T-shirt which said "Big Society" on it. It was very upsetting because basically that's all Steve had was
Okay,
election
this is-
T-shirts.
Polly's got a very dark.
It's taken a while, but I
Wet
think this has now
past.
overtaken the weirdest party we've heard about, which was your thing with Cecil Parkinson sitting on the end of a bed talking
No,
about...
so what's this Parkinson? It was Terry Burns.
Oh, yeah. I know, sorry, yeah, the bouncing on the bed with Elton John.
There
That was
no-
me.
Yeah,
Was
Mine was the Clause 4.
Your Clause 4 party, that's what I was
yeah.
thinking of.
I mean, it was the weirdest party I've ever been to, but I did not bounce on the bed with Steve Hilton.
No.
I just wore his
You just wore his
T-shirt.
T-shirt. Okay. Well, I didn't think that's where we were going to end up, but that's the joy of the podcast. Well, we've slightly touched on Steve Hilton and Donald Trump. Up next, we will discuss the impact of the assassination attempt on Donald Trump, but also JD Vance. How to deal with JD Vance, which the government's going to have to try and work out what to do about that very shortly. But let's turn our attention to the election, which is ongoing, the election in the United States. I'm interested we'll talk about JD Vance in a moment. I'm interested in the assassination attempt against Donald Trump, and everyone's saying this is going to help him. Danny, this feels like the sort of thing you might know about. I was wondering whether, does it help it? Because who was going to vote for Joe Biden, who is now going to vote for Donald Trump because of it? Or does it mobilise a base, or does it just make the people who are already going to vote for him more enthusiastically?
Dubious. There's a dynamic in the US election, which is that Donald Trump appears more, whatever his other flaws, more dynamic than Joe Biden because of the age issue. That's certainly a problem for the Democrats, which they don't seem to be grasping. And I could see a way in which this might add to that. But generally, and I'd be interested in what the others have a view, most people look at political situations where, let's say, for example, England had won the Euros before a general election. There are lots of people who say that would have helped Rishi Sunak because of the feel-good factor. There isn't much evidence for that, really, because people know that it was actually England who won it, not the government. And so it doesn't. And they also know that in the end, Donald Trump wasn't in charge of whether someone shot at him. It may be that his response to that, like with Reagan, did give him a little bit of a boost because of the way that he responded to it. So that may help him, but this is in 4 months' time. So I would say its probable effect is fairly marginal, right? And it's difficult to know what, except for the Reagan incident, it's difficult. I mean, obviously it was when Wallace was shot in 1972, he was so badly injured that was then, he was then pushed out the race really by that. So I can't think of a comparable electoral event at about this distance from an election.
To summarise Danny's view, it won't make any difference, and nothing ever does. But on this, he's right. I mean, the dynamic of this campaign is pretty curious. I mean, last week, people were saying that Trump was weakened because it seemed likely that Biden would leave the race, and Trump views apparently Biden as his favourite candidate. This week, when it seems that Biden is digging in and has no intention of leaving the race, people say that Trump, as a result, is strengthened, and that this may be right. In the middle of all this has come the shooting, and I think it will create a short-term bump in the polls for Trump. I think that's certainly the case. I think there will be some people who are sort of sympathetic, feel sorry and feel outraged, and will say that they support him. But let's just understand something about this race, which is that people have basically decided. There are two candidates, two camps, and people overwhelmingly amongst American voters are in one camp or another. And I don't think this shooting is going to make a difference to that. Where I think it could have an impact on the election, and bear in mind this election is in November and it's a long time ahead, is the intensity of support for one candidate or another. I think that Trump's supporters will feel, much more intense in their desire and determination to see him win. And as we know, for whatever reason, Mr. Biden's supporters feel less intensely committed to him. So there's an intensity gap opening up in this race.
Which can play out then in turnout.
And this turns out can be reflected in the turnout, in participation in the election. And that could turn out to be, quite important. I just don't know what you would do, frankly, if you were Mr. Biden, to sort of take back the initiative in this race. It's very difficult for him to continue to demonize Trump. He's already said he was wrong to use the word bullseye. So his whole framing of his campaign has been, this man is an affront to democracy. He's a danger to the country. Heaven knows what will ensue if he ever gets back into the White House. I think it's just become more difficult for Mr. Biden to frame his his campaign in that way.
Polly.
So that's the one thing I was going to add, really, to what Peter and Danny have said, is partly because Trump supporters got out there very, very quickly with a blame narrative that this was the Democrats' fault, despite the fact that it seems the gunman was a registered Republican, but Democrats' fault for saying that that Trump was a threat to democracy, that he was a bit like Hitler, which it turns out is what JD Vance also had potentially said. But and I think Peter's right that they will be a lot more cautious about those kinds of narratives. The question is whether that actually helps or hinders them. There is a sense in which sometimes kind of the hysterical message that sort of doom is coming, which we saw, from the Remain campaign in Brexit. It doesn't necessarily land with people, because to the people who are already deeply partisan on one side, it feels like you're accusing them of being stupid or evil, and that just gets their backs up. And it creates a sort of dynamic of disbelief, really, because people find it hard to imagine the scale of the impending doom. And so maybe by moving away from a narrative that Donald Trump is Hitler, they will find an alternative. But I'm not sure what it is, because, as Peter says, the question of what you could possibly do to seize back the initiative at this stage is really difficult.
Well, and one of the reasons for that is that what the Democrats are proposing to do is grotesquely irresponsible. Whether or not Joe Biden can win an election against Donald Trump, which is what has concerned a lot of people observing it who don't want Donald Trump to win, of which I count myself, is that's only one part of the problem. Yeah. They are proposing that the leader of the United States, at a time of tremendous world instability and internal instability, be someone who quite clearly cannot be president in 4 years' time based on his obvious decline. And everybody can see it. We all know it. They also know it. There is what I call a market failure in coups. It's never in political coups. It's never in the interest of your internal party critic to be the person who makes the obvious statement you have to go, because they then get sort of passed the blame.
Market failure in your party. They've been very good at coups. Got rid of one leader after another.
Because there's a very interesting, important reason for that, which is that the mechanism of getting rid of the leader is anonymous. So it doesn't require you can whisper it and you can build up a base against it without anybody in the cabinet.
It doesn't require a visible knife in the back.
Correct. And so the Conservative Party has created a system that overcomes the market failure in political coups, much to its disbenefit.
So if in the Democrats, if they had the same party rules as the Tories, everyone would have put their letters in by now, and then there would be a vote of confidence.
Yes, absolutely. So this has not happened. And anyway, one of the reasons why Donald Trump, and much, much more important than this terrible incident, is that people look at it and they can see that the Democrats are trying to do something which we all would accept. And by the way, in 1944, Roosevelt did almost exactly the same thing. And had he not got rid of Henry Wallace just before the election in 44 and replaced him with Harry Truman, the whole of the post-war history would have been changed by this irresponsibility of running for office when everybody around him knew he was dying. Now, to a certain extent, people around him persuaded themselves, oh, look, the gaffer looks quite good today and he'll be fine. So I'm sure there's that going on around Joe Biden. So they're half persuading himself it's not as bad as it looks. But we can all see and we all know, and it's very irresponsible, sadly.
And he's doing this whole series of interviews this week, and I think just getting through to the end of them without committing any more gaffes will be used as evidence that he's fine.
I mean, Joe Biden's always made gaffes, by the way, right? I mean, he has. That's always been part of who he is. But that's different. It's different. That's different. But it's just different. And because this is part of his market failure. For me, there are a few consequences to saying what is clearly the case. I definitely want a Democrat candidate to defeat Donald Trump because, I do think Donald Trump is a narcissist, and I think he is dangerous, his political views. And I also disapprove of the 2025 plan for changing the United States Constitution. I think that has effects for us, so it's therefore is a bit our business as well, not just United States business. I want all of those things, but you cannot. You are
stop him. I mean, I don't. I mean, let's take what you say at face value, Danny. What can stop him? I mean, everything bounces off Trump. There's almost no gaffe, no mistake, no pitfall, no chasm he can fall into that seems to be able to make any difference to him. Indeed, the more damage that's done to him by these things, the more intensely his supporters love him and want to vote for him.
It's a big enough coalition in the United States that they've formulated that it's hard to contest. You know,
and now they've got JD Vance.
But and I'm afraid that's a smart pick, whatever one might think of JD Vance as a person.
We've mentioned JD Vance, so let's hear then. This is Donald Trump's pick for the vice presidential nominee, speaking at the recent National Conservatism Conference.
I have to beat up on the UK, just one additional thing. I was talking with a friend recently, and we were talking about, one of the big dangers in the world, of course, is nuclear proliferation, though, of course, the Biden administration doesn't care about it. And I was talking about, what is the first truly Islamist country that will get a nuclear weapon? And we were like, maybe it's Iran, maybe Pakistan already kind of counts. And then we sort of finally decided maybe it's actually the UK, since Labour just took over.
Polly, the next vice president of the United States of America.
Made a joke about Britain being Islamist. I'd like to think that he made a joke rather than that he actually thinks that the Labour Party, for all of its faults, is Islamist. I mean, it's worrying, right? Because from a pragmatic foreign policy perspective, the special relationship, the relationship with the United States is absolutely foundational to our security, our defence cooperation, intelligence sharing, and our economy. And if, as seems now incredibly likely, we have an isolationist president and an isolationist vice president, it's deeply troubling for the future of the Western Alliance, for the future of Europe, certainly for Ukraine as an acute situation. And I was trying to think what could give me hope this morning, and it's really only that Donald Trump doesn't actually believe in anything, and so it's possible he'll just completely volte-face on everything he's ever said and take a different stance. And JD Vance also has the ability to completely pivot and change his mind about things. So maybe they just will pursue in office something different from what they've promised.
Well, Labour is not an Islamist party, and Britain is not an Islamist country. And fortunately, we have in our Foreign Secretary, David Lammy, a bestie of JD Vance. They've met a few times, they get on, they have quite a lot in common. Both come from disadvantaged backgrounds, working class communities, and made good. I mean, JD Vance ended up at the Yale Law School, whilst David Lammy ended up at the Harvard Law School. They've both written books. I don't think David Lammy's book Tribes has yet been turned into a film, but it's probably only a matter of time. And they meet and they talk, and I'm sure David will be able to point out to JD Vance the truth about this country. But going back to the campaign, I don't know from the Republicans' point of view what there is to dislike about JD Vance as a vice presidential candidate. I mean, he's a sort of anti-elitist member of the elite. He's an anti-business, ex-venture capitalist. He comes from a working class community but made good in the Marines and Yale Law School. I mean, he's young, he's articulate. What is there from the Republicans' point of view not to like?
Yeah, it's very interesting. You mentioned David Lammy. You're right about them having met, whether they're quite besties may be an exaggeration, but they certainly built a relationship, and there's a reason for that. The two books I've read that I found most informative about the kind of Trump vote and some of, and David Lammy's book about the London riots, actually, which I thought was really interesting about his own background and about working people into a world that was different, completely different to mine. my own refugee story is completely different to his, and it was just really, really interesting. And then the JD Vance's hillbilly elegy, but they've taken very different paths. And JD Vance was at one point, part of the movement that was saying the Republican Party basically needed to move towards the centre in order to deal with the complicated, family histories like his, and that was in the context in which he said he wasn't sure whether Trump would be a kind of cynical Nixon who might have some good points, or the America's Hitler, and he's then shifted his position on Trump, and it's hard not to see that as quite cynical. David Frum, who employed him to write articles for his journal, and who was a sort of leading critic of the direction of the Republican Party from inside the conservative movement in the United States, says that, it's not that interesting why Vance has made this movement. It's kind of obvious why he's done it, because electoral and political. The interesting question with him is, where is he going? The distressing thing about this joke, Mitt Romney said of JD Vance, there's nobody I disrespect as much as JD Vance, because he thinks JD Vance is completely cynical in his view. So this was a joke, but it's a completely targeted joke. It is, in my view, a racist joke as well. And he knows exactly what he's doing, whom he's appealing to, and he knows why it's wrong, and that makes it worse. But he is also very bright. He's a legislator who's got some legislative achievements, works with other people, has got relationships even with the left in the United States, not with the centre, because he's not, because that's what he's against. I think he is a really, really interesting, quite troubling figure, and this is quite a troubling statement. But the flip side of that is, because he's been so cynical, he's also potentially somebody who could be a hopeful figure if he were to flip back.
If he thinks he could flip back.
But that's not where he is at the moment.
And he's changed his mind about Donald Trump, Polly, but so's David Lammy, who once called Donald Trump a woman-hating, neo-Nazi sympathising sociopath. And apparently now he's best mates with his best mate.
But it is those things.
I mean, David Lammy is the Foreign Secretary, and he has been building up to that role for some time, and he has taken his responsibilities as a sort of pending Foreign Secretary incredibly seriously. He's taken a lot of advice from a lot of people. He's thought very deeply both about what he really thinks and how he needs to present himself, and, as Peter says, which relationships he needs to build. Diplomacy is predicated absolutely on relationships, and he has taken a stance which lots of people will accuse of being cynical, but in fact, I think is deeply pragmatic, and exactly what makes him equipped to be a Foreign Secretary.
I mean, David Lammy hasn't said anything about Donald Trump that's worse than JD Vance has said, and he seems to have profited from his previous statements.
He did have to go to Mar-a-Lago and grovel quite a lot, though, didn't he? What do you think will hold David Lammy back?
I mean, the point about David Lammy is that he does have an ability to reach across the aisle. He does connect and talk to people he disagrees with, and that is the job, as Polly has said, of a Foreign Secretary, which is why I think he will make quite an interesting and distinguished Foreign Secretary.
So I think this is a mature approach that they're taking, and I think they're right to be very diplomatic about it. The problem, though, isn't really the terrible things that he's said, or Ed Miliband has said, and others have said about Donald Trump. The problem is they're mostly right. That's the problem with them. And therefore, the problem for this country is that somebody's going to become president of the United States, quite possibly, and I would say quite probably, who could lead the United States towards isolationism, and who's a troubling ally when we're so dependent upon them. That is an extremely difficult thing for us to navigate. Now, let's hope that there are some people who will listen to this on the Republican side who will think that that's nonsense and it's exaggeration. And all I can say is I really hope it is.
And the fact that Keir Starmer called Donald Trump, apparently against the advice of his closest aides. Originally he would suggest he should send a note of sympathy after the assassination attempt. He made a point of calling him. What do you make of that, Peter?
I think he was right to back his own judgment. I think his instinct was right in this matter. I don't know who advised him not to do it. I hadn't heard that. But again, it's in your instinct in these situations that counts for a lot. You don't sort of take lots of advice and written submissions and take all day to make up your mind. You know instinctively what the right thing is to do. And of course, I think also the King was right to communicate with Mr. Trump. This is the signal most important relationship for our country, that with the United States. Of course, we're going to be turning to Europe, later this week. I think there's a European political community meeting taking place, and Starmer is the host, and he will be wanting to, set out his stall a bit to the Europeans. But that doesn't remove the fact that our relationship with America, both in respect of our security, our defence, intelligence relationship, economics, trade, investment, it just became much more important, even more important to us after Brexit.
Well, we'll see how it all pans out. We've probably all we've got time for. Are you familiar with Fesshole, Peter?
No, I am not. I'm not going to buy one. I've never listened to it, and I've never picked it up.
It's a social media account where people make their confessions anonymously.
Oh, sorry.
And someone posted on there, as a teenage girl, I had a massive crush on Peter Mandelson in the late 90s. Posters on my wall level of crush.
Well, she wasn't alone.
Well, did
it's well known that there were a lot of...
So this is a Fesshole?
No, I wasn't allowed to have posters on my wall.
Weren't you?
No.
I had Paul McCartney on my wall.
Right.
Great large numbers of every cutting about Paul McCartney.
Well, on the subject of music, let's round off with we've had another version of the theme song in. This is from Dr. Carwyn Tywin.
Plaid Cymru won 4 seats as well, Strike up the band.
So that was How to Win Election with me, Matt Chorley, plus Peter Mandelson, Polly Mackenzie and Daniel Finkelstein. If you want to get in touch, you can email howtowin@thetimes.co.uk. That was How to Win Election.